Welcome to this talk about the paper Who's Hosting the Block Party? Studying Third-Party Blockage of CSP and SRI. This is joint work with my colleagues Marius Mosche and Martin Jons, who are from the Technical University of Brunswick, and my advisor Ben Stock, and we are both from the CSP Helmer Center for Information Security. So you've probably guessed from the title, this talk is going to be about the content security policy and about subresource integrity. Well, it actually is not so much about subresource integrity because we don't have the time to deal with it, but please find more information in the paper. So talking about the content security policy, the first thing that will probably come to your mind is that there have been numerous studies about it already. What we've seen in those related work is that only very few sites are actually attempting to deploy a content security policy, and out of those that actually do, most of them are super insecure and they're trivially bypassable. And that even disregards things like JSONP endpoints or things like script gadgets. But now we have all of these cool security mechanisms, and they're very, very nice, and they work, right? So are developers to be blamed for dismissing adoption or the incorrect usage of these mechanisms? And that is something that we want to examine in our work. And for that, we will first need to take a step back and study the landscape in which we're operating in. For that, we set up an experiment where we analyzed the top 10,000 sites, out of which roughly 80,000 are interesting for our analysis over the course of 12 weeks. And the main question that we want to answer is which parties are actually contributing incompatible code. And in this question, there's already a very subtle fact that we need to answer beforehand. And that is, what even is a party in the web? So prior research has always resorted to the effective top-level domain plus one, or site, if you want to call it. But let's assume this scenario. So think about you have two host names, p3.com and p3cdn.com. Now, are those two the same party? Now, we as humans will probably guess, okay, this is just a content delivery network of p3.com. So we would say, okay, these are the same party, right? But what about others? So there are also cases where you have, for example, Alibaba and Alimama.com, and there it's not as clear. And we need this separation between these parties, or we need to be able to tell if two host names are of the same party to distinguish between first and third party code, but also to assess how many different third parties are actually contributing behavior that might be incompatible with our security mechanisms. And to get this information, what we'll be doing is we'll collect inclusion trees, one of which you can see as an example on the right side. That is essentially just a causal relation between which scripts include which other scripts into a given document. Now, with these inclusion trees, what we can do is we can use co-occurrence patterns as heuristics to find, for example, first-party CDNs or third-party CDNs. So in the case of first-party CDNs, if a given host name is only ever included by the first party on the first-party site and never anywhere else, it is quite likely that it is a first-party CDN. Similarly, if we see a particular host that is always including another host, even on different documents owned by different parties, then it's quite likely that this might be a third-party CDN. So we use these heuristics and pair them with manual verification to, in the end, get 1,140 same party relations. Now we also augment this with public information, for example, from the WebXray dataset, where they have attribution from host names to tracking entities, which again constitute 50 same party relations that we can use. So in the end, we have 1,200 of these relations, which allow us to reason about whether a given host name is actually first party, even though it has a different host name, but also if we have a third party that includes yet another third party host, if those are actually the same party or not. Now, let's jump into the problems that we can observe for our security mechanism. In this case, we're talking about the content security policy. If you know where CSP is coming from, at the beginning, you could have these host-based allow lists, and you can have the unsafe-inline and unsafe-eval and so on. But in essence, you wanted to restrict from which hosts further scripting resources could be fetched from. Now in this graph, what you can see is over the course of our complete experiment, the amount of sites out of those 8,000 that, for example, have a new host that is being added compared to all of the previous weeks. We also have new third-party hosts, which is if a third party included this host, so not the first party. And new delegated host is if a third-party host includes another host, which is of a different party. Now the same is plotted for sites, so the ETLD plus 1, which is a little bit different. Now looking at this graph as a whole, what we can see is that in week 1, as we expect, the numbers are quite high, and then they will start to level out. But what is important is that there is no clear downwards trend, meaning that we see week after week there is, with a little bit of fluctuating numbers, there are new hosts or new sites being added that we haven't seen prior to that. Now, if you think about applying this to what this actually means to a content security policy or a host-based allow list, you would need to continuously update this allow list to account for all these new hosts or all these new sites. And now keep in mind that you need to do this in real time, because if you have a host that is now included, if it's not in the allow list, it will just break and functionality will be broken for this site. Now, there is this discussion that host-based allow lists are not the way forward for cross-site scripting protection, which is obviously true. And there are things like strict dynamic which make it easier and such that we don't need to rely on these allow lists. Still, CSP experts recommend that you have two separate CSPs, one that protects you against cross-site scripting and another one that protects you against unwanted inclusions. And for the case of unwanted inclusions, what we can conclude is that there is a very high maintenance cost for any such allow list. Moving on to the second problem, and that is a lot of CSP are actually needing the unsafe inline keyword, which make them trivially bypassable by an attacker. So the unsafe inline directive handles anything when the application uses inline event handlers or inline scripts, and those are denied by default. So you need this unsafe inline directive to allow them. What we can see is that out of these around 8,000 sites that we analyzed, 7,600 need this unsafe inline directive because either first-party code or third-party code exhibits behavior that needs this compatibility mode. Importantly, in 6,041 out of those, we have a third party that needs this unsafe inline mode. With 5,970-ish due to them writing inline event handlers and 3,600 where third parties write inline scripts. Now, if we only look at this domain of inline event handlers, we can see that 1,900 sites need this mode solely because of their third parties. Now, why is this an important or interesting number? Well, inline scripts can be nonced, which means they can be essentially allowed via a nonce, but event handlers cannot. So they will always be in the way of like in specific whitelisting, except if we disregard something like unsafe hashes, which is another compatibility mode, which is however not yet universally supported across browsers. Now, we can also look at the amount of different third parties that would necessitate such compatibility modes. And what we can see is that for 4,570 of our investigated applications, there's actually more than one third party that needs this unsafe inline compatibility mode. That's quite a tremendous amount of sites that would need to convince the third parties to change their code in order for the first party to be able to deploy a sane content security policy. Now let's look at the case of eval. It's quite similar to unsafe inline, yet if you have unsafe eval, this does not mean that your policy is trivially bypassable. Still, we can see that we have 6,300 sites that need unsafe eval, out of which 4,900 around have third-party code that needs to be able to use eval. We see 1,900 where only third-party code leads to this incompatibility or would necessitate unsafe eval. And we see that again in 2,900 cases, there are more than one third party which would need unsafe eval. Now, speaking of multiple parties needing these compatibility modes, in this graph you can see how many parties are affecting how many sites, depending on unsafe inline or unsafe eval as compatibility modes. Now, what we can see is that there is a rather long tail with some applications needing the support of quite a significant amount of different third parties to help them get rid of these compatibility modes, or to get rid of these constructs that would necessitate a compatibility mode. What I find particularly interesting, if you look at unsafe inline, and we have 2,000 sites that would need the cooperation of 5 parties, 5 different parties, to help them adjust the code base to no longer need unsafe inline, which is quite a significant amount of work. Also bear in mind that these third parties, they are contributing this code to the first party. They might not even use it themselves. So there might not be a direct incentive for these third parties to refactor this code because it doesn't affect their security. Moving on, strict dynamic was envisioned as the savior of making CSP better usable by developers. And what we can see is for strict dynamic, there's one case where we have incompatibility that is introduced because it relies on you adding scripts programmatically. And if you don't do this, for example, via document write, which are then parser inserted, you again have an incompatibility with strict dynamic. We can see that this is, however, only the case for roughly 18% or 1,100 sites, which have this due to their third parties. But there is a catch, namely strict dynamic necessitates nonces or hashes. And if you remember back, this means that we have this problem with the inline event handlers. If we take this into account, then we have 6,157 sites, or 76% of our dataset, which can no longer use strict dynamic. So it isn't really an option for all those sites at all. So having talked to you about all of this, it's actually looking quite grim, but there are some things that we can do from here. And one of the things that I specifically want to mention is that third parties are in this unique position that they have the ability to change the security of the web for good. So they can really help us shape the future of the web and make it far more secure in that they enable the first parties to deploy these security mechanisms. What I also want to highlight is that we as a security community, when designing security mechanisms, we need to take into account that these features must work for the large tail of the web and not only for some top companies, because top companies might not need to rely on advertisement or marketing or something like chat services for which they use the products or libraries of other businesses, and they can just use their own code for everything. But this means that our security mechanisms need to be aware of how the web really is and what the behavior is that we can find in the real world. Also, there are recent advances where we want to hide features behind, for example, the deployment of a sane CSP. And this is an interesting concept, yet it's quite problematic to think about if we block these features for a large portion of the web and make them inaccessible to a large portion of the web. One thing that I also want to highlight is that we should normalize security advice. So when you have a library that you like hand out to other people, we should normalize that developers should have the information how this affects their security. So how this interoperates with their own CSP and what this means for their security. Until then, we have open sourced parts of our toolchain in a tool which we call Smurf, which helps developers analyze their inclusion relations. To come back to the initial questions, are developers to be blamed for this situation? It's really not that easy to say. We have seen that third parties are contributing code that leads to lots of incompatibilities, and overall it's really hard to just blame first party developers for it. And with that, I actually like to close, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.